The letter arrived on a morning that already felt heavy, a plain white envelope among bills and junk mail, but the weight of it pressed into my hands like it knew something I didn't. By noon, my life had split cleanly in two. One half was the quiet, overlooked existence I had always known. The other was the realization that I had inherited 1,000 acres of land, and that the powerful OA that had made my life miserable for years was unknowingly sitting right on top of it. Tomorrow, they would learn who truly owned their streets, and nothing would ever be the same again. Before the story goes any further, take a second with me. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the idea that quiet people can carry unimaginable strength, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps stories like this alive. The land came from my grandfather, a man I barely knew and yet somehow understood better after his death than I ever had while he was alive. He was the kind of man who never raised his voice, who fixed fences at dawn and read county records at night, who believed ownership was not about power but responsibility. I had moved into the edge of his old property years earlier, into a small house pressed up against the border of a sprawling gated community with manicured lawns and strict rules enforced by a homeowners association that thrived on control. They fined me for the angle of my mailbox for weeds that grew back faster than my grief after my mother died for parking too close to the edge of my own driveway. I worked 2 jobs, kept my head down, and paid what I could, absorbing humiliation like rain soaking into dry ground. When the inheritance letter came, it didn't feel like a blessing at first. It felt like a cruel joke. 1,000 acres sounded like fantasy to someone who measured groceries to the dollar and skipped doctor visits to save money. But the documents were real, the maps undeniable. The land wrapped around the entire HOA development like a patient giant. The streets they drove on, the sidewalks they bragged about, the ornamental ponds they photographed for brochures. All of it sat on easements carved decades ago through land my grandfather had never sold. He at least allowed trusted. And somewhere along the way, the HOA forgot whose ground they stood on. I walked the property that evening as the sun sank low, turning the asphalt roads gold and the fences into long shadows. I remembered being a child, holding my grandfather's hand as he explained that land remembers how it is treated. He had been pushed once too often by developers, underestimated because he spoke softly. He responded not with shouting, but with preparation. He kept records. He paid taxes. He waited, standing there now, the wind moving through tall grass. I felt his presence like a steady hand on my back. The fear I had carried for years began to shift, not disappearing, but changing shape into something sturdier. The HOA board had a reputation. They were efficient, ruthless, and deeply convinced of their own importance. Their newsletters read like royal decrees. Their meetings were invitation only unless you were summoned. I had been summoned plenty of times. The thought of facing them with this knowledge made my stomach knot, but there was also a quiet certainty growing in me. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, about dignity, about a man's legacy and a community that had forgotten humility. That night, I didn't sleep. I spread the documents across my kitchen table, tracing boundaries, reading clauses, understanding the depth of what had been entrusted to me. The streets were not owned by the HOA, they were used by them. Maintained by fees collected from residents, yes, but legally resting on land still deeded to my family. The easements required respect, cooperation, and renewal. None of those had happened in decades. My grandfather had known this day might come. He had prepared me without ever telling me. The next morning felt electric, like the air before a storm. I went to work as usual, stocked shelves, smiled at customers, carried the secret like a second heartbeat. News travels fast in controlled communities, but truth moves slower, choosing its moment. That moment arrived when certified letters were delivered to every board member, outlining the ownership, the expired agreements, the invitation to renegotiate in good faith. I did not threaten. I did not boast. I simply stated facts backed by law and history. The backlash was immediate and predictable. Notices appeared on my door accusing me of harassment, of trying to destabilize property values. Old fines were reissued, new ones invented, but something had shifted. Their power suddenly felt brittle. They were loud because they were afraid. Residents began to whisper, to question. Some remembered my grandfather, remembered waving to him as children, remembered when the land was open and kind. Days passed, heavy with tension. I walked those streets now with a different posture, still quiet, but no longer shrinking. I noticed details I had ignored before: the cracks in the pavement, the trees planted without permission, the drainage that flooded lower homes every spring. Responsibilities settled onto my shoulders, not as a burden, but as a calling. Owning land meant caring for people on it, even those who had been unkind. When the meeting finally happened, it wasn't cinematic in the way movies promise. No shouting, no dramatic confessions. Just a room full of people confronted with the limits of their authority. Papers slid across tables. Lawyers spoke in measured tones, and slowly, inevitably, the truth rooted itself in the room. The HOA did not own what they thought they owned. They could not bully their way out of it. What followed was not triumph, but choice. I could have closed the streets, demanded back payments, forced compliance that would have broken families who had nothing to do with the board's arrogance. The power to do so sat in my hands, heavy and tempting. But then I thought of my grandfather fixing fences at dawn, of his belief that land remembers. I thought of the nights I cried alone over fines I couldn't afford. I thought of how easy it is to become what hurts you. So I offered something different. New agreements, fair and transparent. Lower fees tied to actual maintenance, open meetings. A community land trust for shared spaces. Accountability for the board and protection for residents. Some called it weakness. Others cried with relief. Change is rarely clean, but it can be kind. Over the following months, the neighborhood softened. Lawns grew wilder, more human. Children played without fear of reprimand. The HOA transformed from an enforcer into a steward, smaller and answerable. I sold small parcels of land to fund repairs and set aside conservation areas my grandfather had always loved. For the first time, I felt rooted not just to soil, but to people. Near the end of this story, before the final moment settles, I want to ask you something from the heart. If this journey, this quiet turning of power into responsibility, has touched you in any way, please engage with this video. Like it, share it, and let the algorithm carry this story to someone who needs to hear it. And just before we close, I have a special request. Please leave a comment with one word that describes how this story made you feel. Those words matter more than you know. On the anniversary of my grandfather's death, I walked the boundary lines again. The streets were busy, alive with ordinary life. No one noticed me, and that felt right. Ownership is not about being seen. It is about standing firm when it counts and stepping back when it doesn't. I placed a small marker in the ground where he used to sit and watch the sunset, and I thanked him for trusting me with more than land. He trusted me with a lesson the world desperately needs: that real power listens, real strength forgives, and the ground beneath our feet carries the stories of how we choose to live.